Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
Today we are talking about the role of emotional development in Enneagram-based inner work.
Yes, Bea, you're very emotional. And not only that, you know about emotional development, both because of your own journey and because you're a psychotherapist. And I have learned quite a bit with you, and also in the many years I did therapy myself, especially being a 5, because I was not very emotional in the beginning. I mean, I still struggle a bit with that, but I'm better. And I think that all types need to develop emotionally, don't you think?
I do. And I think one of the reasons why we chose this topic for today is we think and talk a lot about what constitutes really good, deep work when someone's using the Enneagram as a growth tool. And at different stages of someone's inner growth process, they need to do different things. And one of the things they really need to do is understand what emotions they have more access to, what emotions they have less access to, and develop an ability to have more access to all their emotions, because this is a very key part of what it means to grow, what it means to develop yourself. And when working with the Enneagram, it provides us, of course, a guide to inner growth. And one of the things it can highlight about the different types and subtypes is what's your relationship with emotions generally and with specific emotions.
Right. And the reason why it's important for all types to develop emotionally is because all of us need to develop our emotional center. And it's underdeveloped when we are starting to do inner work. There are many things that we need to do with the emotional center that sometimes we allow other intelligence centers to do instead. And the result is not the best, at the very least, for our inner growth. And that it also applies to heart types, choose 3s and 4s. Perhaps surprisingly for our podcast listeners. Do you agree with this, Bea? And what could you say about choose 3s and 4s developing emotionally?
Yeah, I just want to highlight what you're saying in case people aren't following in terms of the centers of intelligence. So the Enneagram model is based on this idea that we all have these 3 centers of intelligence: head, heart, and body. And some types come more from one center than the other. And at least in the way Gurdjieff talked about the centers of intelligence, and Gurdjieff is one of the main sources we have about the Enneagram symbol itself and a kind of wisdom tradition that the Enneagram is connected to that talks a lot about what it means to transform as a human. And I think what we're saying when we talk about emotions is that depending on which center you're based in, whether you're a head type, a heart type, or a body-based type, you'll have a different sort of baseline connection to your emotions. And I think you're right that it's not necessarily the case that emotional types, people who are based in the heart center, have, are problem free when it comes to feeling their emotions and having access to all emotions. And so, yes, we need to talk about all 9 types in terms of what their relationship is like to their emotions, what the tendencies are, and how that sheds light on what each type needs to do to work on themselves to get full access to all their emotions and get access, like you're saying, to their center of intelligence that is the heart, that is the base of this important function, which is our emotions.
Yes, I just think, Bea, that the heart types might have a slightly different challenge in emotional development than the other 6 types. twos, threes, and fours sometimes need to learn how to regulate their emotions so that they're not too intense and so that they don't steal energy from sensations and thoughts, for instance. And on top of this, um, there are some biases that are very specific for hard types. As one example, I remember a very wise student of ours in one of our recent retreats saying, um, I am a four, and I've realized that I need to get in touch with the true drama behind my drama, meaning that there is a lot of fuss that sometimes fours do around some daily emotions of whatever is happening right now, but maybe they are not completely in touch with deeper emotions around other major issues, including traumas. And there are specific things to say about each type. So all nine types need to develop emotionally. And last but not least, we also teach that um, before we become spiritual, we need to become human. And dealing with emotions and integrating them well is a big part of becoming human.
Yes, and it's important to talk about what that means. And I think what we're saying is when we're using the Enneagram as a growth model, one of the things it highlights is that we need to have a kind of healthy access to each center. We need to be able to think and analyze clearly from our head and be objective, and we need to be able to feel our emotions and have empathy for others, and we need to have access to our body where we feel sensations and kind of get a gut sense of things. It's a kind of kinesthetic knowing or kinesthetic intelligence. And for each of these centers, what's good is when we not only have access, but we use the right center for the right purpose. And one of the things we talk about is how if I'm an emotional type, like I am, I'm a two, I can sometimes think with my feelings. So I may think I'm thinking about something, but it's so colored with my emotions that I'm actually potentially thinking with my heart center, which is a wrong use of that center. I should think with my head. And similarly, you as a five may think about your emotions rather than actually having your emotions or coming from your feelings. Your emotions may not be fully engaged, but you may think that they are. And that can happen with the body center as well. So, part of what we're talking about here is getting really clear with yourself when you're doing your self observation work with the Enneagram and then developing at a deeper level and really asking the question, do I have full access to my heart? Can I open my heart, or is it kind of shut down for one reason or another? And oftentimes, because of what's happened to us in our past, we have needed to defend ourselves. And so we may shut down our hearts. And often we do that without realizing we've done it. And again, like you've said, any type can shut down their heart. A heart type can also do that. And so I think what we want to talk about is what does it mean to develop emotionally, to have access to all your emotions? Why is that important? And then talk about that in terms of the nine types and the subtypes. I want to say a little bit about sort of what I see as a healthy process of having access to emotions and feeling emotions and the value of that. But what else would you add to what how we've set this up so far?
Well, in my case, I can easily bypass emotions if I lose track of doing my inner work. Fives have fear of feeling, and I can just think of my emotions or not even do that. So each type and each subtype has specific tendencies on how to stop dealing properly with emotions. And we are here to talk about this precisely. And this is why we think that everybody needs to do emotional development work, no exception made. Sometimes, I see people thinking that emotional work, especially in therapy, is just for people who have gone through traumas or who have serious emotional issues. But no, it's really for everybody, because if you are in the business of self developing, that is a must. You don't need to have a very serious issue to need to work on your emotional patterns and need to work on opening up your heart. And the heart shuts down for several reasons, but it always shuts down. Always. No exception made. When we lose touch with one emotion, we have this illusion that we'll still have access to the heart, but it's not like that. If we avoid feeling one particular emotion, we shut the whole heart, because the heart is just one organ. And if we don't use it for that particular emotion, it's like telling the heart that we don't want to use it when we should. So when we say the heart, we many times say only what the Enneagram describes as the lower heart, which is that heart inside the chest on the left hand side. But when we come from a higher perspective, which is what the Enneagram does, the true heart is not that. The true heart is spiritual. It's another dimension of the heart, capable of connecting to higher level emotions like goodness, like gratitude, forgiveness, and all very noble higher level emotions. And those are simply not achievable if we haven't worked on lower level emotions first, and if we don't integrate all of them. So, we're going to talk about this during this podcast, but as an introduction, I believe that each and all of the 27 subtypes do something to avoid feeling at the very least one of the four basic emotions. And that is shutting down the lower heart, not to mention that as a definition, we all shut down the higher heart. We shut down the lower heart because we avoid feeling one of the four emotions at least. And we all have the higher level of the heart shut down unless we are having a meaningful spiritual experience.
So the four basic emotions are anger, fear, sadness, and happiness. So anger, of course, is connected to the body-based types in a foundational way, in that each of those three types, based in the body center, 8, 9, and 1, are shaped. Those personalities are shaped in a foundational way by the emotion of anger. The head types, of course, are shaped by their relationship to fear, and the heart types are shaped in connection with their relationship with sadness or grief at loss, more precisely. So these are the three core emotions and how they relate to the triads. And I think what we're saying is that each of the types will have a connection more to one emotion than the others. And as you were saying, when we shut off our connection, and of course that happens unconsciously, to one or another of the emotions, there's, in a way, the heart gets shut down to more than one emotion, because it's all connected in some way. So I think we will be talking about these three emotions in particular, but of course there are many emotions connected to these, disappointment, and then there are also the passions, which are emotional states of the heart. But we'll focus on anger, fear, sadness, and happiness, and in terms of each of the types, because I think it's very interesting to think about which types have more access to certain emotions but tend to be unconscious to, or repress, or otherwise avoid experiencing other emotions. And of course, this is really important for us to know because when we are using the Enneagram as a growth tool, this is one of the ways it can help us by helping us see what emotions do we tend to overdo or kind of live too much in, and what emotions do we not have access to. And our baseline assumption here is that we all, as you said, need to become human and need to get access to all centers of intelligence. And so we all need to learn to have access to all our emotions in order to be healthy, in order to be healthy emotionally, in order to be connected to ourselves and available for connection, true connection with others.
Yes, that's it. And we are going to talk about the subtypes, the 27 subtypes, instead of talking about types, because we see very important differences among the subtypes of each type when it comes to what emotion they have more access to. Now, before we do that, I just want to say that emotional development includes many other important things. You mentioned the passions, and being in touch with the passion more directly is another very important thing to develop for any of us. That must come with particular emotions we develop towards the emotion of the passion, especially frustration, because the passion is what prevents us from growing further. Another thing that has to do with emotional development is managing our reactivity. We need to know what our reactivity is. We need to manage it later. And that is an emotional work. And also, we all need to develop emotional resilience, meaning that we need to be able to connect all kinds of emotions and stay in them, to develop strength of the heart to go through things instead of bypassing situations.
A couple more points to make to set the stage for talking about the 27 subtypes and their emotional development. First of all, I think it's important to say that, especially in Western culture, and especially, for instance, where I'm from, the United States, I think there's a cultural idea that it's not good to be too emotional. And so I just want to say this because I think it's, for me, for my experience, for instance, one of the reasons why I think I had problems in my emotional development is because growing up, I would get criticized for being too emotional. So I want to say that there are cultural ideas around our emotions that it also may be really important to be aware of when we're working on ourselves emotionally. And so that's one thing. Another thing is I'd like to just highlight what I think is, and this comes from my experience as a psychotherapist, what I think of as the role of our emotions in the healthy operation of the human being. And I want to say that I believe that emotions bring information. They bring very important information about how we're doing, what's important to us, how we feel about things, what's okay and not okay. They are important in making boundaries. They're important in celebrating life. They're important in connecting with people. And there's so many important things about being emotional and having access to emotions that I think sometimes we don't realize. So I wanted to highlight that. And so what we're really talking about here is how important it is for all people of all types and subtypes to almost evaluate or assess themselves in terms of how they're doing emotionally. And hopefully when people listen to this, they'll be thinking about that as we go through. One last point I want to make is I think what a healthy process of feeling specific emotions is first of all being open and receptive to observing or noticing or feeling what's coming up emotionally. So if I'm feeling sad about something, I allow that emotion to be there and I allow myself to just feel it. And I think many times, and we'll be talking about this, different types and subtypes, they have an automatic or unconscious way of avoiding registering certain emotions. And again, I can't emphasize enough how often this is very unconscious. It happens at the level of the defense mechanisms or the defensive system that is the personality, because the personality is designed in part to protect us as we're growing up in childhood, because there are emotional experiences we have early on in life that would be too overwhelming for us to experience. So as we're growing, our body, our system is wise and will sometimes make us or help us not be in touch with emotions, because if we were, as for instance, when we go through something traumatic, we would not be able to handle it, or our psyches are not developed enough or capable of feeling or having certain emotional experiences. Let's say if you see something, you see something traumatic, or you go through something traumatic, it's often the case that your system will shut down to certain emotional experiences as a way of keeping you whole and safe. And so when we reach adulthood, oftentimes it's very important, and this is why it's good to go for everyone to do psychotherapy. It's good to revisit the past and realize, what experiences have I had that unconsciously have shut me down to certain emotions? And what do I need to do to revisit that so I can regain access to emotions that I shut down to early on that I don't realize that I've fully shut down to? So that's partly setting the stage. Now, optimally, in the ideal circumstance, with each emotion we feel, we register it, we feel it, we allow it, we get in touch with it to the extent that we need to understand the information it's bringing. So if I'm sad about something, I allow my sadness. Maybe I need to have a good cry. And through that experience of allowing that emotion, I learn, maybe it's that I lost a friend and I learn how important that person was to me. I honor that person by feeling sad at losing that person. And it's part of a process I need to go through. People are familiar probably with the stages of grief. And the whole point is that we need to allow the different emotions to come through us so that we can move beyond them. So a healthy emotional process is allowing the feeling, gaining the information that it has to bring us, being in it for as long as we need to for it to deliver its information and for us to have the experience that we need to have. And then at a certain point, we let it go and it moves through us and it passes away. And we're open and available for a different emotional experience should we need to have one. So I think that that's a kind of thing we need to say, because as we go through, the different types will have uh, different issues at the different stages of what I just said. In other words, sometimes people have problems feeling the feeling in the first place. Sometimes they may feel a feeling, but they have problems sharing the feeling. And I think as part of the process of feeling it, registering it, allowing it to be there, sometimes it's important for us to share that feeling with someone else. Uh, Sometimes just to be witnessed in it or be supported in it. Sometimes it's because the feeling is motivating us to connect with someone or to share important information. Sometimes it's because we need to be held or understood in that experience as part of the process of having the emotion before we can let it go. And so all of these are important aspects of, I think, emotional experience that sometimes we don't fully realize or give enough attention to. I wanted to say all that as a way of introducing this topic of the emotional situation of each of the 27 subtypes. So let's talk about the different types and their relationships to their different emotions. And let's talk about the subtypes as we go through. Does that sound like a good idea?
Sure, I'll just add something about the triad first, the body types as a whole, eights, nines, and ones. Sometimes these three types tend to access the sensations more than the emotions, and or they try either to convert emotions into sensations, therefore losing touch with the emotions as they are. One of the ways this happens is when they feel something, they go do something about it, which is not the best idea when it comes to building emotional resilience. The thing is, when we feel emotions, we need to just stay feeling emotions instead of go do something about them. So this is just some generic comment about body types, but as to eights, here's what I think, and I would love to see your comments be. Self-preservation eights tend to have a very big anger, but almost no sadness. Social eights tend to have a very big happiness, also a big anger, but in my view, even bigger happiness, but almost no fear. And sexual eights tend to have a very big anger and happiness, but almost no fear. So, what I mean about these tendencies is that when those three subtypes of eight are not yet developed emotionally, this is the tendency. And what they need to do to develop emotionally is to balance those tendencies, like being less angry or even less happy all the time, so that they also allow some more space to develop the neglected emotions. What are your comments about this?
I think that eights often don't have access to the more vulnerable emotions. And this is reflected in what you've said. Usually they have easy access to anger. They don't always necessarily express it every time they feel it, but often they do. And certainly they feel freer to express it than probably almost every other type, not every type. And I'm not sure what I think about what you're saying in terms of the happiness. I guess when I think about the eights that I know, I don't always think they're always happy. I wonder if that has to do more with history, how much access they have to happiness. I tend to think sometimes I could see that, but sometimes not so much. But that's something I think I would need to study further. But I would say my main comment about eights is that they tend to, as you said, not have much access to fear and hurt and pain and sadness, uh, anything you might put under the category of vulnerable, but much easier access to anger. And they may feel at a deeper level, like, say, hurt, but register the anger. So we often say in the therapy world that when someone feels anger, there's always something underneath it. And I think the eights, I would say all three of the eights often don't feel the emotion under the anger that might be motivating it. Like if someone feels hurt, they might get angry, and that's more types than eight, of course, can do that. I would say that I think sexual eights or one-to-one eights do have more access to some more emotions. You'll often see sexual eights cry, for instance, more than the other two eights. So I do think sometimes there is more emotion there or more passion. Not necessarily vulnerable feelings, maybe motivating them to cry, but sometimes maybe because there is a kind of a more of an emotional intensity about the sexual eight.
Right, I get your point, B. In my experience with eights, I believe that while some eights are more serious, most eights are happier than average. And the thing is, lust as excess of any kind sometimes is expressed in excessive excitement or excessive happiness. And I think it's important for eights to see that as a manifestation of the passion. It's not because it's happiness that it's good for you. And I see that for some eights, happiness comes even above anger. But I totally get your point, and I thank you for your comment. Should we move on to nines?
Yes, let's do.
So, what I see as tendencies for nines is that, and this is also something I want to see your take in because I'll be a bit controversial. I believe that all three subtypes of nines feel very few emotions. They are not in touch with emotions. And I think this is something that not many people say in the Enneagram field, because sometimes there is a mistake that says, well, nines are nice, and therefore they're uh, warm, as if they were emotional. But I don't think at all that they are emotional. So, in my view, the tendency for all three subtypes of nines is not being emotional. On the other hand, the emotions that nines avoid the most, in my view, vary according to subtype. So, self preservation nines avoid more happiness and sadness. Social nines avoid many emotions, including anger, sadness, and fear. And sexual nines avoid fear and anger. So, what would be your comments? And I really like that we discuss all this in here. We don't need to agree and one learn with the other.
So I do agree that nines may not be as emotional as they appear, either to themselves or others. And you're right, we do often attribute emotions to the feeling of warmth. What would you say that warmth comes from, if not emotions?
I think it comes from an instinctual desire for harmony. And it's more a body based feel good drive that nines have. Energy, and by energy, I mean instinctual drive to have comfort and to have harmony all around. And I don't think at all this is an emotional thing.
I see. That's interesting. I think a lot of people find that um, an interesting piece. I do agree with you that it takes work for nines to get in touch with their emotions, and this is definitely something that they need to focus on. And I also agree that the different subtypes of nine have more or less access to different emotions. I do feel that I do believe that this self preservation nine has a bit more access to anger. They may not always express it, they may express it passively, but I do think that it's there. I've known people in my past that I couldn't really decide if they were an 8 or a 9, and they turned out to be a self-preservation 9. And I think that's because sometimes there can be more of an angry energy, even if it's not overtly expressed as in the way that 8s do.
Yes, I agree with you. And this is why I did not say, only for self preservation nines, I did not say that they have no access to anger. I said that only for social and sexual nines.
Right, exactly. I do think that, of course, self preservation nines need to develop more access to anger and, of course, the ability to express it more, as do the other two nines as well. It's very important that they gain more access to anger. And, of course, we often talk about how social nines need to get more in touch with sadness because usually there's a sadness underneath that is associated with not belonging that they need to get more in touch with. So I think that's important, an important emotional insight to have if you're a social nine, that part of your work is getting in touch with anger and part of it is getting in touch with sadness. And of course, fear as well. I do think that sexual nines often report that they experience themselves as emotional. I have a good friend who's a sexual nine, and she often says, "Are you sure I'm not a 4?" And so I think, but again, I think it may be connected to what we said before that sometimes nines can perceive themselves as emotional, but it may come from something more instinctual.
Yeah, I think they are the most emotional of this not very emotional type. And I just want to say that sloth, as the passion of nines, also has to do with numbing out the heart a little bit to emotions in general. Among other things, it's not only that. Shall we move on to ones? So, starting with self preservation ones, I think, B, that they feel a big fear more than anger. They feel almost no happiness, unfortunately. I mean, most self preservation ones, not all. And they have a very small perceived anger. Perceived anger, not anger. I think that all ones have anger as a very central thing, but for self preservation ones, they just find it hard to notice it. And then social ones, they, among the ones in my view, are the ones who have fewer emotions. And I'd say, especially, almost no sadness and fear. And for sexual ones, there is a big anger, both communicated and perceived, but also almost no fear. What do you think?
Yeah, I mostly agree with you. I do really think that the work for the self preservation one is a lot around getting in touch with both fear and anger, that there is a lot of repressed anger, and many self-preservation ones will say they're not angry or they don't feel angry very often, but it's really there and they're just motivated to not be aware of it. And of course, the defense mechanism of reaction formation works unconsciously to make them deny the emotion they're having and express its opposite. So self preservation ones will be very friendly and warm, and at the same time feeling quite angry in a way they're not aware of.
Can I ask you a question before we go on? You said that self preservation ones need to be more aware of fear also. And in my case, I said that they tend to have a big fear. I also made a comment that I want to hear your opinion about, which is many self preservation ones push happiness away more than other ones.
I do think that self preservation ones are I think they're very anxious. Now, feeling anxious doesn't necessarily mean they're quote unquote in touch with fear in the way they might need to. So when I say self-preservation ones need to work on getting in touch with fear, I think they act it out and they may say they're anxious, but they haven't fully understood it in a conscious way. And when you say push away happiness, I want to just take issue with the phrasing of that, because when we say a type or a person pushes away feelings, to me, there's a connotation of consciousness. Like if I push something away, it feels like I'm being conscious. And I can't emphasize enough how much a lot of what we're talking about operates at an unconscious level. So I would say, while yes, I think sometimes self preservation ones don't allow themselves to feel happy, it's very much happening at the unconscious level. And I think part of it is because there's so much anxiety about everything needing to go right or be controlled or be perfect. And also, there's a lot of energy spent unconsciously, of course, at repressing anger. So when we repress an emotion, it actually takes us quite a bit of energy, but we may not realize it. We may just feel tired, but not know why. And so I would say that yes, it's it all happening at an unconscious level. I think self-preservation ones tend to not allow for happiness because there's so much that's being focused on repressing anger and feeling anxious. So I think for the social one, right, I think there's a way that they tend to be more intellectual than the other ones and many other types, and they need to get more in touch with anger. And they need to understand how their anger is motivating the things they do, the way it unconsciously makes them want to be right and more right than other people. And as you say, sexual ones, I believe, are very much in touch with anger, but need to just be more conscious about how they channel it into the things they do. And I also agree that for the social and the sexual ones, they need to get more in touch with fear and especially sadness, because I think oftentimes ones don't allow for happiness or sadness, which sometimes can be the flip side of happiness. Let's do a short break.
The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others.
Bea and Uranio offer much more high-quality Enneagram content on www.cpenneagram.com. If you are an Enneagram enthusiast, visit the website now.
Hello, it's me, Uranio. Just to tell you that Bea and I launched a new online workshop called the Enneagram Masterclass. It's a 6-hour video course that you can access at cpenneagram.com. You can go at your own pace and have lifetime access to it. Many beginner students have already watched it, but advanced students can also learn about the 9 types in a deeper way. We can't wait for you to check it out. Get $75 off your purchase by using code ChestnutPaes75 on cpenneagram.com. Let's move on to the heart types. And in general, heart types have more access to emotions, but sometimes they not necessarily feel the most important emotions they need to feel. And depending on what type we're talking about inside that triad of types, there is more or less access to their own emotions. So let's start with choose. I'll say something here because I'm starting with the content, but you are the choose, so please comment on what I'm going to say. It seems to me that self-preservation choose are probably one of the most emotional types, and they have big sadness, but also big fear and happiness, but almost no anger. And again, I mean when they haven't done enough development work. Social choose tend to have a big happiness but almost no fear. And sexual choose perhaps big happiness and sadness, but having all emotions in general. What are your comments?
I mostly agree with you. As a self-preservation to myself, I can say that earlier on in life, I repressed a lot of emotions. So I was feeling a lot, but often not clear on what I myself was feeling. So if you asked me, as my first therapist did, what are you feeling right now? I often would say, I don't know. I do think that at a deeper level, there were a lot of emotions there, but on the surface, it was always happy. I was wanting to be happy then, so other people around me would be happy, and so people would want to be around me. So there was a lot of repression. And I think for all twos, it's important to know that we repress our emotions. Now we're also very emotional. So it's a little bit of a both and. And for me, that's been the case. Now, the work for all twos is to just get more conscious of what they're feeling in the moment, what they need to do around that, and what they need to express, and how their emotions are motivating them. So I would say yes to what you're saying. Now, for me as a self-preservation too, I've always been aware of a deeper undercurrent of sadness, or I have been for a long time. But of course, it took me realizing to get beneath the need to be happy to see that. I would say it was a big shock for me, actually, when I learned how fearful I am. And that was when I learned I was a self-preservation too. And it was one of the big insights that came along with that. So I would say I was repressing that also until I wasn't. And yes, I would also say a big project for me has been needing to get in touch with and learn to express anger in a good way. I think that this may be partly going to 8, and it may partly be just what twos do when their needs don't get met, that of course they haven't expressed, is there can be a lot of resentment. So I think I unconsciously felt a lot of, and in some ways it leaked out, resentment, but I do think there's more work that twos need to do generally. And I would say for all 3 twos, getting more in touch with sadness is really important. It's there, but we often don't acknowledge it. And then getting more in touch with anger is very important, so we don't act it out by feeling resentful when people don't meet our needs when we haven't expressed them. And I think that the self preservation two is probably the one who has the most trouble with fear. And I think us twos, we don't have much problem with happiness. However, when we get in touch with our other feelings, and especially sadness, our happiness becomes more genuine and less something fake that we manufacture to make other people around us feel happy.
Right. Thank you for the beautiful class about twos. Now, going on to threes, I think it's important to say that threes are very emotional, differently than many people on the Enneagram field think. Actually, emotions are always nearby, and they knock on the three's door every time. And it takes effort for the three to push emotions away. Now, self-preservation threes have a big fear, in my view, but almost no happiness and sadness. Social threes, in my view, have a big happiness, but almost no sadness. And sexual threes have a big happiness and sadness, but not much anger, and perhaps having more emotions in general than the other threes. Do you agree? What would you say differently than this?
So I would say that self-preservation threes have anxiety, which is there's a little bit of a distinction between this and fear, I would say. Sometimes anxiety is a feeling we have when we have emotions underneath that we're scared of feeling and expressing. And I think that's part of what happens with self-preservation threes. Also, I just think they experience a lot of pressure between being a three and being self preservation dominant, which means they have a lot of pressure to create security for themselves and the people around them. So I think that self preservation threes have a lot of anxiety and need to get in touch with all their emotions at a deeper level. I think that I actually think that sexual threes have more access to anger than they do sadness. Now, the work of the sexual three is to get in touch with the sadness underneath. I've heard many sexual threes say they actually have pretty easy access to anger. It's easier than getting in touch with their sadness, which is more fundamental and more important because it's usually a reflection of the fact that they're not very connected to themselves. I find that the social three also can express more anger, and they tend to be more competitive and aggressive generally. But I think social threes also express a lot of impatience. I think probably all the threes would say they express impatience, which is can be their sort of version of anger, that they usually want to move forward and someone's blocking their path, and they can express a kind of anger that comes out as impatience. But I think all three need to get in touch with their emotions in a more conscious way. We often say that threes are more emotional than people give them credit for. They're just very good at an unconscious level, shutting off their emotions when they go into action as a way of avoiding their emotions because their main coping strategy is to get things done. And of course, as some of us heart types know, emotions often slow you down when you're trying to get things done.
So interesting, Bea, to hear you talk about threes and realize that our experiences are not exactly the same. We may have had different students in the past, and for instance, I saw a pattern on sexual threes not being aware of anger and that being a bit more unconscious, and me having to help them unveil that anger. But it's totally valid. And what it teaches me is how complex these tendencies are and how they don't rely only or type or subtype only. So it's a very rich theme, isn't it?
Yes, and I think each person can also have their own individual story that plays into this whole thing that we're talking about.
Okay, moving on to four. Four is a very emotional type, but there are big differences between the subtypes. So self-preservation fours, very interesting. They don't have all emotions that other fours have. I'd say they are very emotional, but not too visibly. But Perhaps they have less access to anger and fear. Now, social fours have a big sadness, but almost no anger and almost no happiness in the personality state before doing development work. And it's funny how we sometimes tell our social four students that they've got a big problem now because they're getting happy, right? and and then the sexual four has a big, big anger, but almost no sadness because when they start feeling sad, they go to anger instead. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I would say I basically agree with what you're saying. I think the self-preservation for struggles a lot because they feel a lot inside and they don't express it. Sometimes self-preservation fours will say that for a part of their life, they actually repressed emotions. They can look a little bit like twos in this way because they often get the message that other people don't want to hear their difficult feelings or their negative feelings. And so they can appear happy on the outside, but it's really a way of being available for connection, and they hide their feelings inside, sometimes from themselves when they repress it, but usually uh, self-preservation fours will know that they're quite emotional and that they have a full range of access to feelings, but they keep them inside. So the emotional work for the self-preservation four is often to get in touch with all their feelings and share them with others in a more active way, because they kind of get stuck with them and they can be a bit masochistic when they tolerate all their difficult feelings by themselves. I think social fours, I agree with you, tend to get too fixated or too focused on sadness and varieties of feelings that come from sadness and feeling inferior to others. The pain of envy certainly would be in there, and that they need to work through those emotions and get to the place where they can feel and express more anger. Certainly, oftentimes they feel guilty for being angry and they need to move on from feeling sad. So, in other words, they need to be able to process feelings of sadness and let it go at a certain point. And I think also, as you said, to get more open and available for happiness, and to again be more in touch with fear. I do think I want to go back to self-preservation fours for a moment. I do think some self-preservation fours have access to fear quite a bit, coming from the self-preservation instinct to some degree. I think some self-preservation fours tend to have access to anger if they have sexual in the second place in their instinctual sequence. And often I've known many self-preservation fours who will say they can get angry, but only with a partner, like only with one person or two people in their lives. And then yes, the sexual four is probably the angriest of all 27 types. And so they usually have very easy access to anger, but they need to get in touch with the feelings underneath the anger in a way almost similar to eights. They need to get more in touch with the pain of not being understood or their sadness or a sense of lack underneath that tends to motivate their expression of anger. It's like they go to anger to not be in touch with the feelings underneath. And that's a big part of their emotional development, is getting in touch with all the feelings underneath.
Great. So let's move on to head types. In general, head types can fear emotions and, as you said before, use the head and the energy of thoughts to interpret emotions instead of feeling them directly. And I'd say that it's not very comfortable to be in touch with emotions for head types because it's hard to feel they are under control, right? Now, fives are perhaps one of the least emotional types in general, similar to what I said about nines. So, low level of emotions for all subtypes, but self preservation fives having almost no anger and not much happiness. They can be a bit more sad, and I'm sure you're going to comment on this. Social fives perhaps have almost no fear and almost no happiness in general. And I'm talking about tendencies, and again, only before people do development work. And the fear is big, but they don't notice it. And sexual fives are perhaps a bit more emotional, especially in the inside, and but yet they might not be in touch with anger in general.
So I agree with you, especially about the self-preservation five. I believe that self-preservation fives generally detach from a lot of emotions, actually, and don't dwell a lot in emotion. There is probably more fear there than the other two fives. They are more in contact with fear. This is often, I think, what motivates them to create more boundaries with people. Fear of being depleted certainly is a big theme for them. And they really always want to be able to withdraw. And I think there can be some anger they draw on at times just to make boundaries. But generally, I think self preservation fives are the least in touch with anger. And that's probably one of the things they need to work on the most is getting in touch with anger, but also sadness for sure, and to some degree happiness as well. I agree with you around social fives. I think they tend to be probably the most intellectual of the three fives. Although self-preservation fives are quite intellectual, I think self-preservation fives come off as they present as warmer, and there could be a reason there, similar to the nines coming off as warm, coming from instinct. It could be that the self-preservation five comes off as warm because of the avoidance of aggression potentially. But I think social fives tend to appear very intellectual and as you said, not very in touch with most emotions, but maybe more in touch with anger to some degree. And I do agree also with the sexual five comments that you made that they're more emotional on the inside and often have a greater motivation or a greater urgency about expressing emotion, but not openly with everyone, only in the right circumstances or only through poetry or some form of art or through that special relationship that they're looking for. So it's like sexual fives have more contact with probably sadness and those kinds of feelings, and they feel more of a desire to express or have them, but don't always allow themselves the opportunity to probably fully feel them and express them. One other thought occurs to me around social five, and I wonder what you have to say about this as maybe a last comment about five, and that is I think there's a fear of meaninglessness there. And sometimes, like as you said, social fives need to do some work to even get in touch with their fear, although they're fear types, and that fear of meaningless may be a big theme that helps them get in touch with that. What do you think?
So, as we've been noticing, I think this is a very complex theme at this podcast. In my experience, my personal experience as a social five, perhaps because my self-preservation instinct is the last one, which we call repressed, I don't feel this theme of meaninglessness as being a fear I have. It's more a sadness that I feel. But I understand what you're saying, and I think that many other social fives may feel it as fear. Perhaps, especially if self pres is not repressed, but the second instinct. Again, it's getting a bit complex, and this is wonderful for me as a social five. It gets even more interesting. Now, moving on to six. Self preservation six have a very big fear, but almost no anger. Social sixes have almost no sadness and happiness in general because they're very dutiful. But overall, I'd say that they have a low level of emotions and they tend to be the least emotional of the sixes. And sexual sixes have a big anger, the counterphobic six in them, but almost no access to sadness or direct access to fear. There is a big fear, but there is no direct access to that fear. So these are my hypotheses. What are your comments?
Yes, I agree, especially about self preservation six, but also generally. I think self preservation sixes tend to be very aware of their fear and, in some ways, need to learn to manage their fear and their reactions to it. But yes, a big piece of their work is getting in touch with anger, because they tend to fear aggression, both in other people and in themselves. And of course, if they want to get more in touch with their power, which it's really important for self-preservation sixes to do, it's good for them to work on getting in touch with anger, especially, and also perhaps sadness. I do agree also about the social six. I think there's a way that the social six is the least emotional of the sixes and quite an intellectual type. And they need to get in touch with emotions generally, including sometimes fear. I think sometimes social sixes can be out of touch with fear when they do something or react in a way from fear, but aren't always in touch with it, but need to get in touch with, I would say, all emotions, because they can tend to go to the intellectual level as a reaction of feeling fear. I definitely agree that sexual sixes tend to be much more in touch with anger than other emotions, and they often react with anger when they're fearful. So a big piece of the Enneagram based emotional work for sexual sixes is to get in touch with their fear first and foremost. And I think when they do that, it opens them up to getting more in touch with other emotions as well.
Right. So now sevens. You know one thing that makes sevens emotional, be?
What's that?
To be left for last in all our podcasts.
Yes, I think so.
But apart from this, uh, here's what I think are emotional tendencies for our lovely and dear type sevens. Self-pressed sevens tend to have that big happiness, but almost no sadness. Social sevens, overall, I'd say have a low level of emotions, but almost no fear and anger, or almost no awareness of fear, and definitely low anger. And sexual sevens have the very big happiness, but almost no fear, anger, and sadness. How does this sound to you?
It's interesting. I think sevens are interesting when it comes to emotions. They can look emotional, but not always be emotional. I think self preservation sevens tend to be, at least in my view, although I think this actually differs between men and women, or male and female self preservation sevens. I think that they tend to be less emotional and more intellectual, but they are more in touch with fear than the other two sevens. That's been my experience, that self preservation sevens can actually be quite anxious. And I've met self preservation sevens who really question whether they're a six or a seven at times. So I would say that self-preservation sevens need to work on getting in touch with, especially sadness, perhaps, and pain, but also being more aware of anger and fear, and expressing those in a more direct way. I think that social sevens, interestingly, can be emotional at times, probably more obviously emotional than the other types. I think that social sevens tend to be a little bit more in touch with sadness, because there's this within the social seven, this inner conflict between feeling selfish and not wanting to be selfish, having kind of a taboo on selfish, wanting to be of service to others. And so there can be this deeper emotional conflict that makes them both kind of generous and magnanimous at times. I've seen some social sevens look a bit like eights in terms of being able to be more angry. But also, I've seen there be some sadness in there. And so I think they need to get more in touch with the sadness, actually, but also more in touch with fear. Because again, often the sevens fear, particular brand of fear, is more a fear of getting stuck into something emotionally unpleasant. Being trapped in an emotion forever that they don't want to feel is often the one kind of fear that sevens actively relate to. And then I think with sexual sevens, it's interesting. Sexual sevens, I often think of them as emotional, but I don't necessarily think it's emotion. It's more of an intensity. It can feel like an emotionality, but it's like an intensity of expression that I would say is probably more instinctual. I think that they need to be able to develop a tolerance for many feelings, and especially pain and sadness. I think that sexual sevens have the least tolerance for being with other people's emotions, darker emotions like pain and sadness, and certainly being in their own. Although at times, I think if they've avoided them long enough, they sort of get pushed, life will push them there in a way that can be difficult. So I think all sevens need to really work on getting access and being willing to work on the fear of emotions, but then allow themselves to be more in their emotions in a more ongoing way. So I'm glad we did this and talked about emotions. I think there's a lot to say, probably more than we had time for here. So we'll have to do a part 2 at some point. But now it's time for our top 5.
Top 5.
What is our top 5 today, Bea?
Our top 5 today is the top 5 least emotional types on the Enneagram.
I think you came up with this just to point a finger to me.
I think this was your idea, if you'll recall.
Let's go. What is your 5th?
So my 5th is self-preservation 7. I think some self-preservation 7s can be emotional, but I think by and large, the self-preservation 7s can be quite intellectual and not necessarily want to be much in feeling. And I think especially in my experience, if they're men, and of course men are socialized not to be in touch with their feelings, so they have that added issue. What about you? What's your top 5?
My top 5, my 5th is a draw. I couldn't decide. It's self-preservation 3 and social 6. I think both are not particularly emotional, but for different reasons. I think social 6s trust too much systems and policies, and they disconnect from the heart and they become overly rational. And sometimes they disconnect from that one-to-one perspective where we practice emotions the most. While self-press 3s tend to be too pragmatic, and they are the 3s that, in my view, have the hardest time connecting to the emotions that are there. Now, having said that, I want to say that 3s to me almost didn't get to the list because they are emotional deep inside. What is your 4th?
My 4th is self-preservation 8. I think often self-preservation 8s are not very emotional, partly because they're the 8 that remains the least vulnerable, and sometimes I think there's a connection between allowing yourself to be vulnerable and being in touch with emotions at a deeper level. What about you? What's your number 4?
Yes, again, this top 5 was hard for me because I had self-preservation 8 as my 4th also, but then I took it off the list because, there are many other types and subtypes that I see as being not particularly emotional, and I changed my view on 8s in general and self-preservation 8s also when I saw some of them being quite emotional even before developing. Now, my 4th is social 1. I think that social 1 is not particularly emotional. They are like totally instinctive, but also quite rational. And as a result, emotions don't have much space.
Well, I agree with you because social 1 is my number 3. I agree that social 1s can be quite intellectual. They focus a lot on knowing things, knowing the right way to be, and they tend to disconnect from their emotions quite a lot and can control themselves to appear right and to look good in terms of being a good role model of being appropriate, and often that means not being in touch with their emotions or showing emotion. So what's your number 3?
My 3rd is self-preservation 9. As I said, I do think that nines don't have much access to emotions, and among the nines, I think self-pres nines are the ones who have the least access to emotions.
That's interesting. Nines didn't make my list at all. But my number 2 is social 6. In my experience, the social 6s I know tend to be quite intellectual and stay at the mental level, and I don't always see them expressing their emotions very much. And I think it takes some work for social 6s to get in touch with emotions. So they are at my number 2. What about you? What's at your number 2?
It's self-preservation 7s, which also make to your list, but as if I remember well. So it seems that I see even less emotions in them than you do, but the reasons why they are on my list are the reasons that you pointed out. And also because to be very pragmatic and to look to oneself, to be very pragmatic and to look more to oneself than to others, there needs to be less access to emotions. And I think that self-preservation 7s have a particular issue with being empathetic, which doesn't really help them develop their access to the heart.
Yes, that's a good point.
Now, go ahead and tell me the bad news about your number 1, Bea.
I know you saw this coming. My number 1 is social 5. And this is because I see this type as being quite intellectual and being very mental and operating at the level of concepts and not so emotional, not in touch with their heart as much, not so empathic, let's say, which I think is also a good indicator of how emotional someone is. So are you insulted? Are you okay with that? How are you feeling now emotionally, hearing that you are in my top spot, that your subtype is my number 1, least emotional?
I'm sad, but mostly because I agree with you, and it's also my number 1. I am number 1 in something at least, but it's not a merit at all because it's the least emotional. So I see in myself how hard it is to develop emotionally and to have freer and more direct access to emotions. And I do think that social 5s, when in raw personality, tend to be more far away from emotions than most other people, if not everybody else, unfortunately for my social 5 buddies and myself. And this is why it's so important to do emotional development work.
Well, it sounds like you have your work cut out for you then.
Exactly. It's a very important piece of work, and I've been trying hard to do that. Now, it's interesting also how 8s didn't make to my list. They made it to your list, but not to mine. So, food for thought, isn't it?
Yes, we'll have to continue thinking about this important topic of emotions and Enneagram-based inner work. Thank you for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.
Yeah, Enneagram 2.0, find your personality. Chestnut, Paes, Enneagram Academy. What's your type? What's your subtype? So much you can learn. You can be amazing. Go ahead and transform. Explore yourself and others. Grow and follow the flow. And also for the planet, yeah, let your mind blow. It's from Bea and Uranio. Time for you to know and be your best self with Enneagram 2.0. Psychology, self-mastery, work in relationships, spirituality. Come and join the podcast. Oh yeah, it will be fun. Explore the challenges that from now you'll overcome. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in, yeah, it's your personality. Enneagram 2.0. Chestnut, Paes, Enneagram Academy. Hey, Enneagram 2.0. Tune in now.